ya, at ya. Tell you what's master, coming at ya, coming at ya. Rhyme style disaster, coming at ya, at ya. Tell you what's master, coming at ya.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love, alongside my co-host Wilfred Riley and our frequent flyer, Christy Kelly. And we are joined this week by David Greene. He vlogs and writes and speaks on various cultural issues. He
Mhm.
is known as how do you frame yourself?
I
Reactionary
originally started
gadfly?
my channel. Yeah, it was the Distributist was the original blog title, and
Mhm.
it's a reference to a set of European thinkers, Catholics in the early 20th century, largely surrounding G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc, which were they wanted to reorient the economic system around the family.
Mm.
And a lot of people like J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis were inspired by these thinkers, but the philosophy has since become kind of defunct. But I like to draw inspiration from those people, so it was my original title of my blog.
Well, thanks for joining us. Now I feel bad about our topic. It seems boring. It should like we should be talking about some of that stuff. But who
Oh, we can
knows where the
cover it too.
conversation
Yeah.
may go?
Well, yeah, no, I think it's intimately related though, so either
Well,
way.
yeah, most of these things are. That's why I spend most of my time talking more about culture than politics. But of course, it comes up.
Hmm.
And we invited you on to talk immigration, kind of generally, specifically H-1Bs. I'm sure we'll talk about some of the other things.
Yeah,
We've
yeah.
had some guests on who had some very, disparate ideas on. I mean, we had Marianne Williamson on the one end, and then
Hmm.
we had, you know, Denise Long on a couple times, who's
Oh.
pretty much totally anti-immigration across the board. And then James Lindsay, when we spoke to James Lindsay about the why are you laughing? About the woke right. We talk to everybody, Dave.
I think I might be what James Lindsay would call
The
woke
woke
right.
right?
Yeah. I think
That's
the woke
funny
right has
because
appeared
last
on
week
your
we had him on,
channel.
so maybe he was talking about you and we can get a reverse engineering of the
Oh
definition.
yeah, I'd be happy to cover that if you want to ask me questions.
Well, look at that. It all comes full circles. But I guess let's start by you giving us your general view on immigration, what the problem is, what you think we should be doing, or how
Sure.
you view it before we get into the details.
Yeah, so I think really this is sort of one of the big topics of the early 21st century. In the late 21st century, almost all modern first world countries decided that they would have a very, very open immigration policy and bring a lot of people into their countries. And the idea was, well, I mean, it wasn't exactly very explicit at the time, but the idea was that the social fabric was robust enough to sort of absorb and assimilate. That's how it was, sold to people initially, these new incoming groups, and that at the same time, the productivity of these incoming groups would contribute to the GDP while having a minimal impact on natives. And this program amped up and amped up and amped up over the course of the 20th century into the 21st, especially in the country where I'm currently living, Canada. And this kind of, it hit kind of a new dimension in the 1990s where people started trying to bring in more skilled immigrants on a point system, or the system that we call H-1B in the United States. And the idea in all of these programs was to fill a lot of jobs with incoming immigrants and therefore increase productivity and increase GDP, which would also increase the tax revenue available to the state to spend. The problem is that a lot of these models about economic benefit pertaining to immigration and that overwhelming the various costs, I think is kind of outmoded. First of all, I think the fact there's not really a job shortage in most Western countries these days, especially on the high end. And the presence of these immigrants on work visas actually does depress wages. I mean, you can go back and forth quoting studies at each other, but I think it is a contributor to the fact that the cost of labor has been stagnant or declining over the same period of time when these mass immigration policies have been in effect. And at the same time, a lot of the logic for them economically kind of is questionable. First of all, there's a bunch of non-fungible resources in a country that are very, very hard to expand, that are competed over by immigrants. The most prominent one is obviously housing. You see that there's a huge housing boom, which, in terms of prices, it also locks young people out of the market. And the further wages get depressed down and housing costs get inflated up, that's very good for investors. It's very poor for workers who are trying to get a leg into the actual housing ladder, as it were to speak. There are also further impacts on immigration and voting patterns in politics, and you see this all across Europe. And so I guess, the 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 question really is, in my opinion, or I think this is sort of very apparent right now, is I don't think that these mass immigration schemes are working for modern Western countries. I think they need to be slowly unwound. And we need to move back towards a policy where the number of people coming into the country more or less equals the number of people leaving the country. And one of my things is I believe we should be looking for a certain amount of demographic stability. I don't think that we should pursue large changes in the ethnic composition of countries, which is currently going on both in Europe and America. And I guess that's sort of my case against immigration. There's are benefits, and the main benefit is that immigrants come in, it's immediate influx of cash into the system. But because they provide work that our welfare system needs, our social security system needs to pay off the current people who are taking out entitlements. But at the same time, these immigrants are going to take out the money later in the system. So immigration itself is sort of a form of debt in the way. It's short-term good and long-term creates problems. And I think that this is a fundamentally unstable system, and I think it's very ill-suited for the problems we face in the 21st century, where the problem really is how do we get young people economically situated so that they can form families? And so that's my case against immigration in a nutshell, I guess.
Well, that was a mouthful, and so that leaves us a lot to talk about. But Will, the one thing I thought about as he was talking, I'm like,
Yeah.
that's a good point. I don't know why I didn't think about it when we decided to invite him on. So as we talk about immigration a lot, but as you see in the media, the vast majority of those conversations are about illegal immigration, right?
Yeah.
Mm.
So I get as I throw to you, I know your views on illegal immigration, but we don't talk much about legal immigration. So what do you think about immigration before we get to the illegal aspect? But what do you think about immigration, the policy, what we've been doing, what we should be doing, and what Dave laid out for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a good summary of the case against mass modern immigration, which I don't entirely agree with. Um, yeah, I think immigration isn't one of those issues like abortion, I think, where
Mhm.
there's a core moral issue at stake. I mean, how many master carpenters we let in from Monterrey down in Mexico is potentially going to impact the wage to some degree. It's usually about 3 to 5% for working class white and black men in that same job. But those people also create, and women, I suppose, but those people also create jobs, blah, blah, blah. So it's something
Mm.
you can discuss in cost to benefit terms. You have to do immigration logically. I mean, what Canada's been doing under Trudeau, and I'm not an expert on Canada, but seems bizarre to insane. So my understanding is that the population of the country has increased by something like 15%. Dave, is that correct?
Yeah, it's increased by 4% in the last 2 years. So if we take it back, I
Like
mean, it's
10
an
or 12.
accelerated in the last five. So if we take it back till to 2015, I imagine you get to about 15%, given it was a little bit slower in the beginning. It sounds about right. Yes.
Yeah, I think I'm sure both of us are off by a point or two, but yeah, I think that's fucking crazy. Immigration itself, I don't really, legal immigration itself, I don't have a problem with, and I'll do a very brief case for legal immigration. The argument for legal immigration is really that you want more people and more elite people in your country during a time of multipolar global competition, where
Yeah.
obviously there are big dogs like Putin, Xi, and China, so on that are on the global stage. I mean, if people are in your country, a patent that's developed by an Indian or Bosnian engineer in the United States, Indian or Bosnian American engineer in the United States is in the American basket for 15 to 75 years. So people do come over, they do take jobs, but the cutoff for H-1B is $70,000 per year, as I understand. You have to be going into a technical or executive position and working background in the law. I mean, I've read the requirements for H-1B admission. So when people are posting pictures of some cook at Panda Express who put a resume up on the H-1B website from a friendly Asian country or something like that, guy's not getting in. There may be some impact on in-field salaries, but the guy who's making $70,000 is going to come here. Immigrants don't save any more than Americans. Anything he patents is in the American basket, and he's contributing 68,000 to the US economy. So, I mean, I actually think that's a pretty fair case. And when you look at something like, I mean, I wrote a book where I look at GDP, I look at crime rates, I look at all this stuff. And if you say, well, immigrants contribute to declining per capita income, I mean, you can track that from the start of Reagan to today, and that doesn't seem to be the case. I mean, the USA is the richest country in the world in our weight class. Get out of here, Brunei, all that kind of thing. But that hasn't really changed. You can look at crime. Crime peaked actually in black communities primarily, but also in poor white communities. Didn't have anything to do with immigrants. In the 1980s, it went down since. We saw it try to come back up after George Floyd. Citizens said, hell no, bought guns. It's down again. I mean, so there doesn't really seem to be tracking along a lot of the negative pathways. And I agree with Dave on some of the stuff, by the way, but this is the case. There's not any tracking along the negative pathways that are constantly predicted. You see this also with a lot of things on the left and the right, like climactic change, by the way. There are an endless number of predictions you could draw out of the models. Do any of them come true? I mean, very often, not really. I don't invest based on any of them. Um, what else do I have to say about that? I mean, I think that the real arguments against mass immigration actually get more into that basket of things you're not supposed to discuss. Like, does it matter if the ethnic composition of the USA changes wildly? So we're not 80% white and 12% black, and then the descendants of the native peoples of this country. Instead, we're 22% Asian. This is the last projection I have on my desk. 29% Caucasian, Hispanic, blacks stay the same, whites shrink dramatically. I think that there are obvious reasons citizens would be concerned about that. There actually is a response, last thing for me, which is that we've had this conversation about like what is a white person or what is an American every time we've had a surge of immigration. So the Irish and Italians legally, but not socially, were counted as whites. What about
Mhm.
Hispanics? I mean, when people say the USA used to be 80% white, that's because we didn't have Hispanics until 1973. Like Hispanics jumped on sort of the black civil rights bandwagon, no offense, and said, well, if minorities are going to get benefits, the entire state of Texas, South Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, so on is populated by this minority group. So in the past, these groups have generally stood out for a while, been assimilated. Will that happen with a high performing group like Asian Americans who have kids with white Americans? I'd say that's quite likely. But also in the past, what we've done when we've gotten to the level of having these disputes is stop immigration for 30 years. Actually, one last thing. I think there's a much bigger problem when it comes to young white and black guys getting jobs, which is elite overproduction. So like H-1B, I mean, you could cut all of
Yeah.
H-1B. Again, I'm not feeling outraged either way. But right now, 70% of young white and black guys go to college. And among the whites, I think it's like 40% graduate. So you have
Yeah.
all these people that have been told, like, you're going into a lower upper class job, like you're a college graduate from Michigan. And we don't, 40% of the economic sector, most of us have been bosses, isn't made up of those jobs. So that's why you get the flyer from Panda Express, where it's like, this is a solid $80,000 a year job. Most people are shocked that the Michigan guy doesn't want to do that. I'm not necessarily, but the problem there is in immigrants.
Well, I mean, that they don't. I mean, I know why people don't want to take a $78,000 Panda Express job. I mean, and maybe this gets.
I
I
think it's
mean,
going to suck. It's going to be working at Panda
Because
Express.
it's at
well,
Panda
I mean,
Express.
so does I. I've worked Panda Express and I've worked high stress like Silicon Valley jobs, and I actually prefer the food service one. And when it comes to the high stress, like you're an intern of finance, it's not really the fact that these jobs are unpleasant. It's the fact that they have very low status. And the money that they offer is almost always less than it takes to buy a house. The 70,000, 80,000 job cost, they're paying this in urban areas where the cost of housing is atrocious. And so when you look at what young people are looking for, and what they're why are they going to college and going into all this debt to get this degree that doesn't actually help them? Well, I mean, they're looking for status, and they're looking for a path to have a high status life, because that's how you form a family, right? Like, you attract a woman by telling her a story about how you're going to create a life for you and your family that is seen as honorable, that's seen as good. And the thing is that most young women don't see, like, oh, I'm going to be Miss Panda Express, is like, the thing that they're really waiting for. Like I said, a lot of these jobs that especially women take after college, they're like, minor data entry job, admin jobs. They pay really poorly. They pay very, very poorly. But at the same time, they communicate a certain amount of status because they're managerial in nature. And because of that, a lot of these women don't want to date blue collar guys.
That's true. I have many thoughts, but I want to hear what Christy has to say. Christy?
I mean, I guess initially I think I heard you say that there is not a shortage in this area. But then on the same hand, that we need to, the argument is that we need to bring these skilled workers over because we're not producing enough. And I think what Vivek's point was is how can Americans get to the point where we are producing these, skill jobs, whether it's engineering or STEM, or how do we value like producing these type of jobs that we're actually going to need so that we don't need to do the H-1 Bs. And the problem is his campaign was truth, right? And I think Vivek has the tendency to lapse into being too brutally honest. And he's not kind of reading the room as to how that's going to be taken. Because anytime someone says, hey, look, Americans are lazy, right? So to speak, and they're just not producing the type of labor force. So we need these immigrants. But even though the African American community or the Black community doesn't wholesale buy into what Vivek, was selling, there is a strong groundswell of, FBAs, I call them Foundational Black Americans or ADOS, who would say, cut out all immigration. And the reason is they do see whether it's legal immigration or illegal immigration, HB1s, they see it as a direct threat. And I think the problem that we haven't got into, and maybe the thing that also shouldn't be said, is the model minority, right? So you see the immigrants will immediately come over, especially whether it's the Nigerians or Indians, and they'll immediately surpass the average Black American.
You're
And
right.
so why is that? Right. And that is a problem that I think that kind of needs to be addressed, unless you're always going to have this tension between the subset of Americans that are not with immigration in any form because they see it as a threat.
I have something to say about what all of your comments, but I want to give Dave and or Will a chance to reply to Christy first. If you had anything you wanted to say to them.
I mean, I think the whole Vivek idea that American children are lazy, I mean, I understand where it's coming from, but we have to get straight first whether you want to like double the number of professionals you're graduating out of college before you start telling kids to grind away their youth getting these degrees. The message simultaneously can't be we have too many college educated technical professionals and also spend your entire family's wealth and your entire childhood life getting these degrees. I mean, which one is it? I don't understand. It seems to be that these people are speaking out of both ends of their mouths, and it's actually that contradiction that's driving a lot of the anger. I mean, I'm not particularly young, but I talk to a lot of younger guys, like in their 20s, and they're furious at just this contradiction. Like, it can't be we have to be tiger mothers, and just like grind our nose away. And also, these jobs are going away. We don't need them. Which
Mhm.
is it?
Right. Did you
Yeah, I
want to say
mean,
something? Will, go ahead.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think there's some truth on all sides here. First of all, my main point about the Vivek comments is that this is something that conservatives who are native born white or black Americans say all the time. Like what you can disagree with aspects of it, but yeah, the kids are lazy. They spend too much time playing ball and trying to get laid. I mean, every time you go to a church, you hear this. So the idea that this prompted this extreme level of rage, I can't help but see is coming from Vivek's foreign background and some of the perception of him as a fast-talking bullshitter. I mean, you've seen images of him dressed in full-on Lonesome Dove cowboy outfits, colored red, white, and blue, talking in a different tone and so on. So people got pissed off about this, but I think like when he's saying Americans need to match the best professionals around the world, I think that the argument there isn't we need more people to go to college. It's that we need to streamline the college education process so that only deserving people get in and the results mean something. So I think we all might be on the same page here. Like when Christie said these immigrants come here from Nigeria, India, and China, and they beat Black Americans. Immigrants from Nigeria, India, and China also beat white Americans pretty easily. And the question is, how does some guy come from Bangalore and do that? What's the process where the tested IQ in India is 73, but in America it's 104 for Indian Americans? Selection
Well, it's a
explains some
selection
of it.
effect. It's a selection effect,
Yeah.
Some of it
obviously.
is.
Right.
No, but I mean the tested IQ for
Almost all of
Brahmins
it,
in
I
India is
think, right? I mean,
no.
we were brain draining these countries of their elite so they can come over here and crunch numbers for our tech companies instead of
Good.
improving their own countries.
Yeah,
You
good.
know,
But
I'm
I
not
don't,
so
I
happy with
actually,
that.
I don't think anyone, and Dave, I'm not insulting you. I don't think
Yes,
too
sir.
many aggressive people actually care about that. Like when you look at these rival countries like China or India, even Nigeria, and people say, well, we're taking their best. Like, good. I don't want them over there designing nuclear bombs. Screw those foreign states. I think the issue is more now they're over here competing with us. And I don't think it's entirely a selection effect. Mostly a culturalist on IQ. So I mean you can look at the IQ studies on Brahmins in India. I think it's 88 right now. So when you look at members of that same group, plus a lot of Vassia tradesmen beating white and West African, essentially Black Americans, that's actually a pretty impressive performance. And that does have to do with focus, training, like, God damn it, you're going to make it in the USA stuff from parents. So, but anyway, the point is conservatives always say that. Like, why don't we apply this same level of energy and intensity to our kids? I think that's basically a good idea. Like, we don't need more people going to Harvard. We need the Americans going to Harvard to match the Asian IQ score. Now, they might fall a point short for complex reasons, but the basic idea of the Chinese immigrant on the SAT gets on average, what, a 1250? It's a bit above the usual Asian score. The American white score is about 1100. It was 1108 last I looked. So I don't really see any reason that European whites couldn't close that gap, whether that's genetic or cultural. Doing that would actually probably require fewer people going to college. You couldn't have classes that gave an A or a B to everyone because what you're winding up with right now is a system where a lot of people get out of college and they're not really prepared to be lawyers or dentists or anything like that. So I kind of agree with Vivek that we need to take our best people, train them to be as good as everyone else's best people, and tell the rest of the people in that competitive pool, yes, you do need to drive a bus. And that's going to include a lot of native born white and black guys, even if we get rid of H-1B. Like someone needs to drive a bus.
Yep, that's true. I think that so this is the part where I get to listen to all of you, and now I can explain why everyone's wrong. So,
All right.
I, well, actually, I think the real problem is everybody is wrong and right because this is a multivariate problem, and it's really hard to solve it and say anyone's just definitely wrong about that issue because there are other factors that affect it. So we're talking mostly, for instance, legal immigration here, but obviously when you assess the country as a whole, the effects of immigration, whatever, you got that giant albatross of illegal immigration that's hanging around your neck, and it factors in and it plays a part in all of the things you're talking about. Wages. When Dave gave his first kind of summary of the problem, and his first example, he said one really good example was housing, which is a very good example. And another good example is education, since everybody's talking about college and all that stuff.
For sure,
But
yes.
I mean, at the earlier age, right? I'm on the school board here in New York, and there's always a debate about what are you going to do with migrants or, English language learners, which always makes me laugh, side note, but because the schools have been failing for so long, I consider every student an English language learner because many of them don't learn how to read and write. But obviously, if the schools are built for English speaking kids to come into kindergarten speaking English, and now you have a whole budget system, teachers, and this whole infrastructure designed around how you you change things up to maximize the outcome from a group of kids who don't primarily speak English and English is the second language at home, that's going to affect everyone's education, not just that kid. So obviously these things play a part. So you have that. You have what it costs to have people come here illegally. Dave talked about the higher end and how the H1Bs tend to be the people who are working these higher skills. I don't know how much, it may be a little bit, if that drags down wages as much as some of the others do, but obviously it plays a part in that. But you have that's just one facet. But you got people who come legally to do all these other things, but they're competing with Americans for those jobs and the illegals. So that plays a part. And then the other thing is to the Vivek thing, what I thought was interesting is I got his point, but I kind of disagree with it because you're leaving out a major component in it, which is the culture. So in one way, you're saying that they're lazy because like Will said, it's kind of like stop playing video games and not paying attention and focus. If like Will always says, it's simple. You look at these groups, East Asians and everyone else, they're not genetically better. They study more, right? So just study more. That is absolutely true. But also sometimes your advantage can be your disadvantage, right? So you hear people talking about having these first world problems. So it
Sure.
comes to in some of these situations that the first world problem is that you don't have that same struggle as others. So I agree with Dave in part. Will said it's not completely. It's definitely not completely, but selection does play a part, right? You have some people who just have that fear or won't leave where they are, whatever. So you have a certain type of person. It takes a certain amount of drive to decide to leave and go to this country that you don't speak the language that you've never been to and struggle. But the flip side to that though is that you have Americans, some are lazy, yeah, but you might have an American kid who grew up poor and he's got a bit of a work ethic. He wants to do better and he's willing to do the work. But the culture in TVs, movies, and everywhere else, that's what he's used to because that's the music he listens to. That's the TV shows he watches. So you get this immigrant who comes in, right? So the American kids is thinking, yeah, I'll struggle. I'll work two jobs and I'll do this and I'll put in this work. But he's competing against somebody who came from nothing. So to live in one room and not have a bathroom where he is and live with another family, it's like, hey, I can see on the horizon where I'll be. But for an American kid, no matter how poor he is, that is, weird. It's like, I'm not doing that. So there's just a certain level of comfort that we've grown to in this country that even the poor people in American poor kids are not really built around that same kind of cultural lifestyle growing up of the kids we see in India, picking microchips and all these kind of things. So that
Picking
yeah,
microchips
they're digging through
off of
the
bushes.
trash piles trying to
Oh,
pick
okay.
stuff to recycle. But it's just a different mindset. So doesn't mean I think it's wrong to say that they're lazy because they may not have been around or put in a position where they have that drive that they need to have to do what some of these immigrants are doing. So I don't necessarily disagree with him. I think it was just oversimplified.
Well, I mean, there's an interesting kind of middle case in your examples between poor, desperate countries and rich, lazy ones.
Right.
South Korea, that's the one that I think about the most
Right.
when I think of turbo grinders. That South Korea is a rich country, and they just put their kids through the ringer. They grind their youth into dust. All they do is study, all they do is work, and they compete for the same set of really small jobs. And what's the result of all this? Well, the result is that happiness levels are the lowest anywhere in the world. And well, maybe there's some other country that's more unhappy than South Korea. Happiness levels are rock bottom in South Korea. Everyone's depressed. And more fatally, their birth rate, like their family formations, people actually getting married and having kids, it's like sub one child per woman. That country isn't going to exist in another generation. Their population is going to halve. And for what? It's the same number of jobs. It's the same number of jobs, and all they're doing is working and working and working and working, just competing against each other, just burning useless energy for nothing. And if you have a path to productively use the labor for something that's going to actually increase the well-being of the country, then I think you have got a case for just like hustling the hell out of everything. But if the future we're offering our kids is to work longer and longer hours for a less and less, you know, rewarding life, and at the end of that, not even a family. I mean, I keep on coming back to that, but what all of these young guys are complaining about, especially with the Panda Express jobs, it's not having like money in hand, it's having the necessary things, to get a family. And so that's why housing plays such a big role in this too, because your money isn't just your, like, GDP is how much your adjusted GDP is how much your money can buy stuff, but buying 30 computers, or 30 iPhones is not as valuable as being able to buy one house. And housing has, just, exponentially increased, which means your ability of your money that you get in this per capita GDP equation that can actually be meaningfully used to buy yourself a future is worth less and less, even adjusted across the years. So, I mean, that has to be, in my opinion, that question of family formation has to be central to the long-term economic evaluation of whether a country's doing well or not.
Oh, I agree with that real quick. But one thing I want to say about, and I think that's important. We can talk about family or formation, but also what you said about the happiness and grinding people down and that kind of deal, which is totally true. But let's eliminate all the other countries and just look at the U.S. What I'm saying though is that no, it's going to. I think it ties to what you're saying. I think that you may agree with this in the sense that when I talk about the culture matter, so without comparing it to another country, so in the U.S. There's something about the culture that has made it where, because you say there's no job shortage, the jobs are there. Christy disagreed, but if you go back several generations, not that many, you don't have everybody Great Depression or whatever. Go back 2 generations, right? There were always people who were like, if I can just find this job, that pays enough to do this, save up money and live, there was always some, comparing themselves to the Joneses, but there wasn't this big push of just a large swath of jobs that we just simply won't do. And it's because you're like shaming people out of doing certain jobs. So it's not that they can't do it. It's not that they're not capable of learning to do it. It's not that in some cases we're getting to that point. The part about the house is true, but it's not always that the job doesn't pay enough, even though sometimes it does. It's that the people won't do it, but it's not laziness. It's something else to me. I think it's something that where we decide we shame people for doing something. It's like the women. You watch all these women on TV, and it's like you said yourself, Dave, that they won't date, somebody who does blue collar work, or they're like, what was it? Remember Will? Who was it? Ebony? That's crazy. Ebony Williams, who was like, would you date a guy who drives a bus? He's like, does he own the bus?
If I can jump in here, because that's a really good bouncing off point. I want to hear what Christy, as the female member of the panel, has to say about this also in terms of how date eligible some of these dudes are. But I think that
you start a family without them.
Well, yeah, you need a man and a woman, which is a very important point people should remember. But that's basically biology. I'm not going to demonstrate how it works. But anyway, but basically, though, I do think that one thing that we are not talking enough about here, I think a lot of this is basic logical leadership. By the way, we've all been in leadership roles. If the problem's housing, we should build more housing. Like, this is one of those things where I and people on the left, like Armin Domalewski, that are sane, have actually can't talk to people together. Like, if there are a lot of restrictions that stop you from building housing, you can literally just remove those and build housing. Again, you can do whatever you want with immigration, but building housing in cities, if you've ever tried to add on a shed and you followed the rules, is insane. So we should probably do more of that. You can select people into education. I mean, Korea would probably be better served to give an IQ test in 8th grade, like most of the European countries do, that have everyone compete for a limited number of collegiate slots. But another thing that we're talking about here, short of the leadership level, is just what do people take as their due? And again, if the group we're talking about is white and black American men, I think that level is higher than it is almost anywhere else in the world. So, like, the idea that people don't have enough money.
Can you clarify what you mean by due?
Well, what I'm saying is that they're due, what they're owed, what they should be expected to do. And there's actually a question that comes up. We have a pretty good audience, so one of the social scientists in the audience might correct me on this. But there are questions on a number of surveys that ask something very similar to, would you consider living in a 1 or 2 bedroom ranch house with your true love, your high school sweetheart, having 3 kids, 1 car for the family, $50,000 a year job? The percentage of people willing to do that has declined every year, as I recall, feel free to correct me, that the question's been asked. So I think you could very easily live Homer Simpson's life today. You could certainly live the life most people did in the 50s. When you're living in an ethnic neighborhood, this is no, but this is actually true. Like in outside of Chicago, I grew up in East Aurora, which is an area where even now the average rent for a house is like $900. Most people that live there are Mexican or Slavic immigrants. The houses are quite nice. Your kid would have to fight sometimes. You go to an adequate Catholic school. The number of hipster kids in Brooklyn or Chicago that are going to move there and have a child with their girlfriend is zero. So the idea that it is like if you take the average per capita income and you compare it to the cost of everything, including housing, the market basket, which I know you're familiar with. This is, I think it's the market basket's increased 4% in price or something like that. So we're not seeing a dramatic shift. What we're seeing is far fewer people that are willing to do some of this stuff. Like if you ask, just leave Homer Simpson aside. If you ask, like
Yeah, Homer
Rand,
Simpson actually, I think Homer Simpson's a good example, right? Homer Simpson is a
it
blue
wasn't real
collar
though.
worker who has a wife, two cars, a big house in the suburbs where he's not a minority. And I mean, like, I know I have a PhD, and I know people in graduate careers who can't support three kids in the suburbs on
But
their
also, like
salary in
the
science.
one point I threw back there, like Homer Simpson's not real. Now, I personally think, like, if you look at the demographics of Springfield and all that, like, there are plenty of towns of Benton Harbor, Michigan, where you could buy Homer Simpson's house. You would just have to live around people that were immigrants, people that got here from Eastern Europe, black people. I mean, so I'm not saying you'd object to that, but it is very easy to go on Zillow and find where those houses are, and many of them are within an hour of major cities like Chicago. There are a whole bunch of accounts on social media, like what's it, Hickman, that specialize
Yeah,
in doing this. Like, I mean, I'm sure I've seen you guys argue actually, but go to these
yeah.
blue collar towns and buy and flip houses. Like, the houses are there. The town's 40 minutes from a city. The point that I'm making, and this point may be right or wrong to specific members of the audience, is that very few people are going to move to Benton Harbor, live in a $50,000 a year house, marry their high school sweetheart, and share one car between the two of them. And we can track the rate of people willing to do that. The question is, why do people feel that they are owed more than what the conventional norm was for many years? And I think social media plays a huge role there.
Because Kendrick Lamar doesn't rap about that place.
That is, or the outlaw country singers for the white guys. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. You log into Instagram and you see, I won't say bitches, but you see like chicks sitting on beaches and they're from Illinois. Like, I think that this is very real. All the stuff on Instagram is fake. All the stuff on TikTok is fake. I've actually had friends walk outside of their perfectly nice condos in Chicago, normal $30,000 a year residents, but sit on Lake Michigan and act like bosses with like bottles of Moet, like on the beach that hobos are on. You know, that's what people are seeing on
Did they
social
move the
media, but
hobos
no one
first?
knows it's fake.
Get the hobos out of the frame at least?
Yeah, kick a bum out of the screen, kick a seagull, then you sit down like you're at San Tropez. It's like Indiana Dunes, bro. Like I've been there.
So I have the perfect example because I lived in Redondo Beach, California, right by the water for numerous years. And then I got married, and by accident, I won't tell the story now, but by accident, we moved to Meridian, Mississippi for 5 years. Would
I've
I have
fallen down and ended up in Meridian, Mississippi. It could happen.
would I have done that in my 20s? No, probably not even my 30s. You wouldn't have caught me dead in Mississippi. But when life changes, when you mature, and I think this is the point, right? Why are we flocking to the coast or to these expensive cities or to live these lavish lifestyles or these lifestyles of comfort when we could move into flyover country or down south, small cities? It's still affordable and you don't have to kill yourself working.
Sushi.
I don't know. Does any town in America not have sushi? I mean, in the
Right. I'm
90s, that
sure
was
they
like
all
a
do that.
rarity,
Well, I don't
right?
want grocery store sushi or, so no, I think you
Meridian,
did
Mississippi did not. Yeah, it was
that.
debatable.
Wow,
All
look at
right.
that, Dave. See that? I don't want to throw up your,
Catfish sushi.
Panda Express does serve sushi.
yeah, because they
God, really?
We're bringing Asian cuisine to I guess I mean I mean that's music to my ears. I like the idea of people starting up towns
yeah.
in rural areas. I think
The
that
people in those areas won't like it, side note, but go on.
yeah, I mean I think I'm not entirely convinced that the things that I'm seeing from Hickman are actually real things because I can say that just from my own perspective, a lot of married people are very willing now to move, since COVID especially, they're very willing to move out to the country in order to get, more affordable housing.
Yes, I don't want
And
to cut you off, but you said married people, I think, didn't you?
well, I mean, that's the other thing too, right? So
Right. See, because
the
that's the
big thing,
difference.
this is that you anticipated where I was going, right? I think married people might be more open-minded to like, let's all move to this one town and start homesteading it.
Right.
That I could
Mhm.
see that a lot. I think there's an instinct that,
Yeah.
especially among millennial married people like myself, but a lot of people in the other side of this debate, they're in their 20s, they're not married yet. And one of the worst places you could be as a single person for finding, prospects for marriage is in a highly rural area because everywhere there is old.
I disagree
Both
with
of them
that.
are saying, both of
Yeah.
them are like
I
this, Dave.
disagree.
Disagree with that. If
Really?
you look for people that are down and want to get married, like so it depends what you mean. I think everybody cut each other out there. We all jumped in front of Dave's comment, which we do want to come back to. But like I live in the Kentucky state capital, and it depends what you mean by rural. Like, if you mean like some of the stuff Hickman does is a little over the line, where it's like a house sitting in the middle of some haunted village and there are only
Yeah.
two other occupied buildings, and it's like only 70,000. Like, okay,
Like Meridian.
But no, but Meridian, but that's the thing though. Like, if you go to Frankfort, Kentucky, or Meridian, Mississippi, it's a city of about 100,000 people. And I
Mm.
mean, like, I'm leasing a house right now. It's perfectly nice. It's in a subdivision. It's like $1,000 a month. I mean, that's actually extremely typical. And my neighbors include everyone from one judge to guys that are auto mechanics. There's a much greater level of class integration and peaceful racial integration in these mid-sized cities. Look at the high school sports teams. They look like the United Nations. They actually like each other. I mean,
Mm.
then there is in Chicago, for example, which is the big city I'm most familiar with. And I mean, honestly, like if you go to downtown Frankfurt, it's called Brick Street. Like you see lots of happy couples passionately demonstrating their affection for each other. And many of these people get married within a year or two. I think that the whole thing where people are waiting until 33 to see if they make partner, the average marriage age now for women is I think 31, something like that, which is
Yeah,
the
that's
reason for the
crazy.
fertility crisis. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, like that's an urban thing. Like the fertility rate in Kentucky is like 2.9 or something like that. So I'm not shouting out Kentucky specifically. Liberals definitely stay away. It's terrible bears. But I mean, like there are plenty of reasons to go to South Dakota or something like that. Go to a boom town, chase women, join a church,
Well,
go to a
are there
bar.
women in these boom towns? These oil boom towns are almost all men.
Well, there women are coming there now because they know they're going to find men that make
Not a
$130,000 a
man.
year.
Okay,
So like
maybe.
a lot of those towns, like that was originally the joke that I made about that. Like, I don't know, a bit of a sausage fest. Hell no. But I mean, like I've known young mentees that have gone out there, like guys who've been in the army, and yes, like it's now about 30% female. There's also an entire there's a surrounding community, there are universities in the state. It's not where I would ideally choose to live, but I think you are more likely to get married in Billings, Montana, as a pipe jack or a solid college man than you are to get married in Park Ridge, Brooklyn.
Well,
The really quick,
Billings has a college there, though, isn't Billings the home of the university there?
Or Bozeman. I mean, like
Okay.
all the ski tourists go there. Like you would have no trouble, in my experience, as someone who occasionally wilder jocks and who gives speeches. You would have no trouble meeting a woman in downtown Bozeman, Montana, if that were your thing. Like I think that it would be easier to do so. But let's hear what Christy has to say.
yeah, the culture in the South is still in conservative, small town South, not the new South, not Atlanta. That's not considered even the South anymore. But in the traditional South
You have
is
shoes in a
married.
box.
Yeah, married very young. So my daughter, her friends, my daughter, 18-year-old, she just went to like a wedding right after high school. That's still the culture, six kids, big families, married. They're getting married young out there still.
Yeah,
Dave,
and interestingly
anything?
enough, that's
Well,
true for white and black Americans in a lot of the South. Like, I mean, outside of the projects, it's just expected. You're going to do kind of civilizational things. Like, you might do 4 years in the army. You're going to get married. You probably belong to a church. You play varsity
Right.
sports of some kind. And I actually think it's a really healthy culture. Like, I mean, I played sports in high school, but like looking at like the local schools with all the dads screaming and so on, it's kind of like this is a lot different from, the metal detector at the gym in like Aurora or Chicago. There's a lot to be said for it.
well, I'm very much I never grew up in the sort of red American context. I'm from blue America. I'm from California. And I'm glad that this culture hasn't completely died. But from what people are telling me, this is becoming less and less the way things are. These kind of like, old town conservative places where everyone has kind of like these middle class blue collar jobs and gets married and starts families. I mean, I would love it if it was, and I'm not really here to contest you on facts, but from what I'm seeing, the if you look at the overall numbers in this country, the people who are getting married and settling down and having kids when they come to the Zoomers, like the generation that's younger than me, it's just a downward trajectory at the highest levels when it comes to natives and
But
people
I
who
don't
are
know if
born in this country of any race.
I just want to
And
add that that's
yeah,
true, but part of that is also, again, tying everything to culture, the cultural phenomenon that is devices, social media, depression, or whatever, and how these kids don't date, don't look at each other, don't talk to each other in high school and college. So part of that is part of the problem too.
yeah, I guess, but I think that's why I'm kind of worried about it. Seems like we're talking about something that's being sort of a sort of life cycle that's being disrupted
Hmm.
by modern incentive structures, right? I mean,
100%.
and a lot of times the small town structure, what I hear about is, oh well, all of our most talented kids go out to New York and go out to college, and what's who's stuck behind here are kind of the people who can't make it, and that can be reversed obviously if a bunch of successful professionals move back in from the city,
Yeah.
but that's a circumstance that a lot of young people feel very I think that's very felt among people who are younger than I am.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely the phenomenon in my ever since everybody else, where they're from my hometown. I'm from Gary, Indiana,
Hmm.
and that's exactly what happened. I mean, and I was one of them. You graduate high school, and the thing is, what are you going to do when you grow up? Leave? That's what I'm going to be when I grow up, out of
Yeah.
Gary, right? And so, but then I went back. I was in restaurants for years, and I opened a restaurant there, and people were asking me why. I say because if everyone that has a skill or a drive to do something leaves, what is the city going to be left with? Right? So everybody went
100%.
to
Yeah,
medical school
100%.
left,
Yeah.
right? So I mean, there's been a push slowly to try to go back and redevelop, and hopefully that's successful. So you're right about that, and obviously we are on the same accord as far as the family. I do get your concern about where it's not happening, but it's good that Christy and Will do see it happening in some places, and hopefully it'll turn. Maybe it's cyclical. I don't know, but it definitely is a problem. But since we were talking about immigration, right, a lot of that is still how that ties into that, exacerbates the problem or whatever. And one thing I was thinking, I don't want to put any of you on the spot. I didn't
Mm.
know, so I was looking. So earlier I've talked about how it's important, it's hard to, the illegal immigration is tethered, they're all together and they all, you know, it's kind of hard to separate the two when you look at them. And there may be problems like, Dave mentioned with H1Bs and some of the other things. But I was like, I'm wondering how many on the normal basis people that the U.S. takes in legally every year, right? And I had a number in mind, and it ended up being less, but not really because they're factoring in the family, that they bring in when you can bring your relatives. But they're saying,
Mm.
so we know the numbers from the Biden administration that came in illegally, right? So if the numbers of legal immigrants a year is around 675,000, right? We definitely can, augment that. We can diminish it. We can, be more creative about who can come. I think Trump and someone else was talking about, how far into the family you can bring other people, right? We need to do that. And I understand that. But 675 is like almost a rounding error compared to what they've been allowing to happen. So
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, not to say that it's not a problem, it shouldn't be addressed, but the fact that we've let the illegal immigration just fester, like to the point that I'm sure you all saw this the last week. So Trump's doing the raids, everybody's upset. And so in Texas, I saw at least two places, Texas and one other, where people were bold enough to be like out on the street with Mexican flags screaming that they're illegal and they're not going anywhere, right? So that's how comfortable they've gotten. Or flip side, they've gotten so comfortable and become the norm to the point that the media will look at it as like, I can't believe you're deporting people. Here, I'm in New York, as I told you. I was watching the local news last night, and they were, every day is dum 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 the deportation. So they're following around, they're doing this stuff, and they're like, so to their credit, there's a Democrat. You should look him up. He's pretty interesting. His name's Richie Torres, right?
Hmm.
And he represents the poorest neighborhood in New York. He's a Democrat, liberal on a lot of issues, but not on crime, not on all this stuff. So he was boasting about the fact that Trump got this guy out, including, by the way, if you all didn't catch this, because it was a local news, that you all heard about Aurora, the guy in Aurora, California, who took over the apartment complex.
Mm.
Well, that guy was in the
Mm.
Bronx and they got him yesterday, right?
Mm.
So he was like, all of you progressives and liberals are whining about this, saying it's wrong. They're going after the criminals. And I represent this district, and the people and the constituents I represent don't want them here, and they're glad they're gone. So kudos to him. But the funny part is the story. So I'm watching the local news. They're doing the news, interviewing people. People are scared, all that kind of stuff. And then they say, in one raid, they went into this apartment building. They arrested three people who said who were illegals. One of them was the notorious person, who had so many criminal. But one of the people had no criminal record and was still detained. Right. So we
Collateral.
got to the point that, right. So we got to the point that the news and regular people just said, I can't believe they detained somebody who was here illegally. And all they did was, cross the border illegally. Well, that used to be a problem. So we've gotten to the point that no one thinks it's a problem. I mean, everybody's freaking out. I'm sure everywhere you are, it's on the news every day. But these numbers are nothing, right? We got 600,000 coming in legally. We got 1 million coming that were coming in illegally every year for 6 years, and he's deporting 1,000 a day, right?
Yeah.
It's not really that much, right? So, but what does it say that we've conditioned people? We do this with crime, with education, with everything else. We condition a new norm. So yeah, the kids can't read. Let's just lower the standards and make it the norm. So isn't that the bigger issue? Not that this other thing isn't important, Dave, but isn't that the biggest issue that we have let too many people in, obviously, but gotten to the point where we desensitize the people to where they think, and the people who came in who think that they're entitled to be here, and the other people say you're wrong to deport them.
Yeah, I mean, this is another big thing is that America is in the middle of sort of, a crisis of justification for itself morally. We have no idea about who we are as a people and what is sort of what is who defines what's good and bad. And this is a complete disconnect between Blue America and Red America at this stage, and I do not see how this gets healed in any way, shape, or form. I think that there's going to be kind of a division between people who come from a more traditional perspective like myself, and then, the rest of the progressives who just have a radically different view of, what constitutes a good life or not.
Right.
And that's where I see like that's where the problem is stemming from. I don't see anywhere around this problem. I think that I hate to say this. I think kind of Blue America just needs to lose. I say that as being someone who comes from Blue America. I think their perspective on what America is and what can ground its moral system is completely insane, and it will never work, and it will kind of lead to the demographic death and family death of this country. You say, well, and I heard you say like, oh, well, maybe it'll swing back, this whole decline of birth rates. And I'm just thinking of places like South Korea. I'm thinking of places,
Italy, Germany.
Italy, yeah, and yeah, so we have a long way down we can go.
Right.
And a lot of these countries, a lot of these, this whole build more houses solution, that works if you're in Canada. I mean, it kind of works if you're in Canada, right? Because the jobs are still only in a few select locations.
Right.
And if you sprawl out from Vancouver, you get diminishing returns very, very quickly. It kind of works in Canada where you can do like, oh, we'll build a new town like they do in China. It does not work in England. It does not work in Denmark. It does not work in Ireland. And there are going to be a lot of cultural groups in the world that just disappear from this crisis of declining family formation and declining ability to kind of live as humans in the modern world. And that's what kind of really worries me about, or one of the things that worries me about the future in this regard.
Let me ask you one last question, though, because earlier, way back at the beginning, I've been waiting for a moment to bring it up, and it never just flowed instantly, but naturally. But you talked about we got to decide who we want to be here, and you kind of alluded to, what the country should be when we were talking about immigrants. And I think part of that is, and I want to get your take on that, but is that there's a certain type, like to be an American isn't, and I'm not saying you're saying that, but Will can tell you better than I, all the debates
Yeah.
on social media about what's American. I laughed at the guy who was like, black people aren't Americans, right? They were never Americans because of all this other stuff. But there is something that is American, and it's a certain, type. It's an ethos, it's a culture, it's a mindset. You talked about assimilation, right? People used to assimilate, like they used to call us a melting pot. We all grew up, we're old enough to grow up when they say, yeah, America's a melting pot. And now America's a tall salad, right? Where you come in with your different flavors, but you stay tight to what you are. You don't really become one, right? You don't meld together. And
Yeah.
so part of, if you're going to do this, the people you bring in should be people. I mean, you can't bring people in, first of all, it's low-hanging fruit, but you can't bring people in who are antagonistic to your country, one.
That's
And
true.
and you can't bring people in who and it was like phases, right? Because I remember when I worked in restaurant industry, it wasn't as bad as it is now, but I look back and I was telling somebody this. I said, no, so they didn't hate America like some people did. They weren't like, kind of like this entitled mentality. They were very kind and they were friendly people, but they never really considered themselves American, right? They were always like, I'm coming here because there's opportunity, nothing against you. You're not a colonizer. I don't hate you, but I
Mhm.
want to make my money, send a little bit back home, build me a house in Mexico, and go move back to Mexico, right? So they never really wanted to be here. But where some can assimilate and can, buy into what the truth of America and what the American idea is, would you say that those are good immigrants to have?
Yeah, I guess I'm. This is probably what makes me woke, right? And James Lindsay's
Uh,
imagination. I,
all
I
those
don't.
darkies need
Yeah,
to get out.
I know. No, 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 no. I mean,
What?
look. I always say this, right? African Americans are more American than me. My family came in like various different times, but
Right,
my father came in like he became a citizen in like the 70s or something like that. Like this is like I'm ridiculously recent immigrant.
right.
But I see. I don't think that there's one America. I think there's multiple Americas. And originally, the idea of this country was that there wouldn't be like one country. It would be like a lot of different countries and a lot of different cultures
Hmm.
that are all kind of like brought together by very minimalistic requirements.
Hmm.
And then, after the Civil War, the government of this country said, no, actually, America is just going to be like everybody of European descent in one giant group that we'll call white,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Because it's too dangerous to have little different groups of white people because we'll have more civil wars. And, then eventually we got to the 60s and decided that, like, oh, well, we'll throw this open to every single category imaginable. I think that this, the thing is that the white identity in America was always very, how should I put this, shallow. Like Europeans make fun of white Americans for just this reason. Like, because it's so general, because there's so few requirements,
Hmm.
Americans can't really point to anything that's their culture because all vague.
Hmm.
There's no defined history because everyone has a different one. And I think that what people are looking for, and I think that the solution is going to be, is we're going to have to just say, okay, there's lots of different groups in America, and we kind of share a very minimalistic understanding of what a good life is.
Hmm.
But we don't necessarily do things the same way. We don't necessarily want to organize our education the same way or have the same community priorities. And I think that we can accommodate that. Um, because, but insofar as, the problem is with just saying like anyone can assimilate here is you get this concept of an American that is so absolutely bare bones in general. It can include anybody. It's like
Hmm.
just speak English and follow the HR guidelines at your corporate
Now,
job,
now, I mean,
and then
I know
you're an
you're speaking in
American.
general,
Like,
but I want to make sure I don't think that anyone can assimilate, right?
mm,
I just think that there are some who can, and I agree that there may be different Americas, but I don't think we may necessarily agree on what those lines are or how that's divided, right? Because you make some good points about how they
mhm.
don't necessarily have the same idea on, how to live, what to do the same things and all that. But that seems to be more, I mean, to be abstract and kind of, blanket is not the best example. More left right than, Mexican American and Irish American.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, the big division, well, we'll see. We'll see how long-lasting progressive America is, when it comes down to it. But the big division that's dividing America right now is a religious war that's going on, not to put it too bluntly. There's a religious war inside white America right now. And that religious war between progressives and conservative concepts of what it means to be American is overshadowing all other divisions, such that a conservative is going to feel much more at home with a conservative Catholic, from Mexico or Argentina than he will, like these crazy progressive people from Berkeley, California, and that's absolutely true. It's just I just think that I feel like a broken record, but if there's one thing that drives the birth rate up, it's this kind of sense of cultural continuity. That's why the Amish birth rate is so high. That's why the Mormon birth rate is so high. That's why religious people have such a high birth rate. That's why religiously conservative Muslims have high birth rates. It's this idea that you're part of something and you're going to make sacrifices for continuation, and that can only be facilitated if your project has sort of more specifics to it, and it's not just you're an economic unit that lives in this particular place and it's kind of interchangeable with everybody else's.
Okay, I got to stop and let them get in. Will,
Yeah, I mean, this is probably one of my last comments for the night. A good conversation, but I mean, yeah. First of all, I would really question. This is one of the core arguments of kind of dissident right philosophy that like cultural continuity improves things like family structure.
Mhm.
As a political scientist, I've looked at Eastern Europe and West Africa, other regions where they've had multi-story buildings for 1,000 years, and I don't really find that to be true. I mean, in Russia, there are more abortions than babies born in many years. So, I mean,
Mhm.
I would have to actually, I think a lot of these things are empirical questions. I often find that edgy right wing guys are at least as accurate about claims as lunatic academics today, for example. But it's something you'd have to look at country by country, like how culturally contiguous is this country, like Moldova, Bosnia. I mean, just go through this entire region, the former Yugoslavia, Serbia. Now, what's the birth rate? Greece. I mean, all
Yeah, yeah. Just a correction though. I don't mean homogeneity. Like there's lots of homogeneous countries. Like Korea is homogeneous and it's the lowest possible.
that was
It's
going to
not
be my next
homogeneity.
example. Yeah,
Yeah,
but we'd have to measure what cultural continuity means. Because I mean, if you say that Japan is not a racially proud, culturally contiguous country, again, I don't know if that's right or wrong until we get all 172 of them in there, but I don't know what that would mean in that sense. So I mean, that's something we should actually check out. In terms of can
sure.
immigrants assimilate? I mean, yeah, I would say that, and again, these are all empirical questions. And whenever I see like the right wing guy, left wing guy yelling style of Twitter communication, yeah, I'll usually jump in with a right wing guy. But like, I always want to see data on this. So, like, for example, if you say there's an American identity based around obeying the law, I think that's a key one, speaking English fluently, accepting the country is good, and center right politics or something like that, do you find less attachment to that identity among Venezuelans or Mexicans than among current era immigrants from white countries or among white or black Americans? Because I'm not sure you do. Like, we'd have to look at that. So one last thing I would say, by the way, I think it's interesting, great conversation, but I noticed that we haven't really discussed illegal immigration that
Mhm.
much. Would get rid of the 40 million illegal immigrants if we look at remittances in the
I
country
did.
before I did
I did
anything
it
else.
twice.
Yeah, but Charles, like you were saying you're a boss in the restaurant sector and these guys weren't Americans. Those
So
guys
it's
were
my
not
fault.
actually Americans. None of them were supposed to be in this country. And we've all worked in restaurants. Like, I mean, so I think you'd have to ask, like, what
Wait
about
till
the
he finds
preacher
out I
from
hired
Venezuela?
people with H-1B visas.
Yeah, I don't know how you hired him, what the technology was, but I bet E-Verify would have cleared the kitchen out. So I mean,
I'm
like,
the
I think that
problem.
no, but I mean, it's virtually impossible to run that sector and not have that issue. But I think that that's where really a lot of these issues should be focused. People say there are 11 million illegal aliens in the USA. That claim's been made since Ann Coulter made fun of it in 2008.
Right.
If you look at like the research from Bayer, it's 30, 40 million.
It's
So I mean,
over
really, I think
10%. That's insane.
yeah, that would be my focus, not some Indian guy that has a degree in whatever from the University of Bangalore. But again, I think there's going to be a lot of discussion around this for some time to come.
Christy Kelly.
Yeah, just to kind of, close it out to my last comment, I definitely love the focus on family. And I do think you are seeing the shift among right-wing culture and young right-wing culture with the focus on family, this whole trad wife, phenomena that's going on. The TikTok is good for some things,
Uh,
changing the culture among kids. But I think that there has to be a breaking point with the left. There has to be a point at some point where they're going to realize, like these women that are, trying to just be bosses and, oh, we don't want kids. I mean, half of the women that I went to college with now are depressed and sad and don't have kids and can't have kids because we're, in our 40s.
Old.
So,
Mhm. That's the word you were looking for. Let me help you out.
so
Can't
you're
ever say
gonna
it to a lady.
the comment section is gonna light up after that one. So
Hmm.
I think that until we reach the other half of the country, how do we reach them? And there has to be a breaking point. I mean, there has to be a point. Somehow we're negotiating against our own interests, not promoting marriage and family and, abortion on demand and everything else that is just driving down America.
Well, I hate to end on a sour note. Dave, I hope you come back. We can talk about family because that's really
Sure.
important and some other things. But Christy, there's not going to be a breaking point. Just being real with you. Dave says they got to lose. That's a good point. Or the only other alternative, we need more Richie Torreses. If Democrats don't just flat out say, look, I don't like the Trump guy, whatever they want to say about Trump, but what you're doing is stupid. Stop it until they do that. Then it's just everything you say from center right. It's just that's because you're a Nazi or you're a right wing zealot. You need people in the House to say, close that window. Go ahead, Will.
Mhm.
No, like, I mean, you could also, there's a radical idea where we could just tell people the truth. Like, diversity has some very positive economic and military effects, but it causes tension. So, if we're going to have a lot of diversity, we need to teach people about basic patriotism, English speaking, so on from the beginning. That's how we assimilated massive white groups from Italy and so on. The same thing with fertility. Like, nobody knows anything about fertility. There was a female feminist commentator on Twitter the other day who was teasing some guy about saying he preferred unprotected sex. And she asked, do you think women can only get pregnant 4 or 5 days out of the month? And I'm not a woman, but I know the answer to that is yes, just having grown up in a different era. And like a bunch of people, male and female, started explaining ovulation. Like, yes, I'm in a serious relationship. And let me tell you what happens around this period of the cycle. And
Something about a
there was
clock.
just yeah, but there was just utter shock among like all of the women under about 28 in the thread. So I mean, I think just telling people like the age of peak fertility for humans is between 18 and 23. Sounds kind of awkward to say that, but it just sort of is. Like you're gonna have to make these decisions. It's gonna be very difficult to make partner and then have the standard 3 kids that you want. Like just doing that in the schools as opposed to teaching people that their proper gender is platypus would have an enormous impact. Like we already see that 20% of kids now say they're gay. Why don't they say they want to be wives or husbands? We can do that as easily.
All right, we'll end it there. He is woke right, David. I'm kidding, he's not woke right. David Greene, the
You can call me
distributor.
woke right. I'm fine with that, actually. I'm kind of growing accustomed to it.
He's like, I'm growing.
I
It's
like it.
growing on me.
Yeah, it's great. It is growing on me.
Well, Dave, it's been great talking to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm saving the day from you commies who lame. No, you can't fuck with me. I got a country to save. God bless the US of A. Land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to save because I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.